The narrative you were sold in 2008 was a $700 billion bailout. It was a fabrication. Behind the scenes, the Federal Reserve was secretly funneling $16 trillion to Wall Street, foreign institutions, and hedge funds. This deception was maintained for 3 long years, concealed from public view until a Bloomberg lawsuit shattered the silence and forced a confession. The beneficiaries? Goldman Sachs received a staggering $600 billion. Morgan Stanley, an astronomical $2 trillion. Citigroup was handed $2.5 trillion. Bank of America, $1.3 trillion. And Deutsche Bank, a foreign entity, walked away with $354 billion of your dollars. And for this, not a single banker faced prosecution. There were 0 prosecutions. Instead, they rewarded themselves with millions in bonuses, funded by the very bailout money meant to avert disaster, all while you faced foreclosure, unemployment, and the evaporation of your life savings. The executives on Wall Street emerged wealthier than ever, and for 3 years, the Federal Reserve, Congress, and the Treasury were complicit in a coordinated deception, a lie that held until legal action dragged the truth into the light. This is the anatomy of that story. It is the chronicle of the greatest financial crime ever committed, the $16 trillion heist they desperately tried to conceal, and an analysis of why a repeat is not just possible, but inevitable. The date was September 15th, 2008. The event? Lehman Brothers declared bankruptcy. A $600 billion collapse, the largest corporate failure in the nation's history. The stock market went into freefall. Credit markets seized. Widespread panic ensued. The financial crisis was no longer a threat. It was a reality. And from the government, a promise of a solution. A plan they called TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program. Its stated purpose? To inject $700 billion to stabilize the system, purchase toxic assets, and rescue the banks to save the wider economy. While Congress deliberated, public outrage reached a fever pitch. A bailout for Wall Street? For the very institutions that engineered the catastrophe? The official response was grim. There was no other choice. They were too big to fail. A collapse of the banks meant a collapse of everything. The entire economic infrastructure would crumble. Your savings, your employment, your entire way of life was on the line. And so, on October 3rd, 2008, Congress approved TARP, $700 billion. It was sold as the largest bailout in American history. That was the official story. The one broadcast on television, the one printed in the papers. $700 billion. But it was a deception. A deliberate, meticulously calculated lie. Because as Congress publicly debated the $700 billion figure, the Federal Reserve was operating in the shadows, secretly channeling trillions, not billions, but trillions, directly to Wall Street. This secret liquidity was extended to foreign banks and hedge funds through clandestine programs with names intentionally designed to be obscure. They did not inform you. They did not inform Congress. No one was told. For 3 years, the operation remained a closely guarded secret, until Bloomberg News initiated a legal battle, filing a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit and fighting for 2 years in court to force a disclosure. Finally, in 2011, the truth was exhumed. The Federal Reserve's lending wasn't $700 billion. The real figure was $16 trillion. Let that sink in. $16 trillion. An amount 23 times larger than what you were told. But as the full data set was released, the situation appeared even more dire. The $16 trillion figure, it turned out, wasn't the complete picture. That number merely represented the cumulative total of all loans over a period of time. Analysis of the peak of the crisis revealed a far more shocking number. The Federal Reserve had $7.7 trillion in outstanding loans simultaneously. This amounts to more than half of the entire United States' gross domestic product, loaned out in absolute secrecy. And the recipients were not limited to domestic institutions. Foreign banks were major beneficiaries: Deutsche Bank, UBS, Barclays, Credit Suisse. Institutions based in Germany, Switzerland, Britain, and France. They received hundreds of billions in capital, backed by the American taxpayer, and you were told nothing. Let us now re-examine the official narrative from 2008. TARP, the $700 billion rescue. Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, stood before Congress with a stark warning. The global financial system was on the brink of total collapse. He argued they required $700 billion to purchase toxic mortgage-backed securities, purge the bank's balance sheets, and stabilize the system. Congress was deeply reluctant to authorize it. The public was incensed. The central question was, why should taxpayers be forced to rescue Wall Street? But Paulson, alongside Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke, insisted that there was no viable alternative. Under immense pressure, Congress passed the bill, $700 billion, authorized on October 3, 2008. This is the figure etched in public memory, but here is the critical, undisclosed fact. The $700 billion TARP was not the real bailout. It was a diversion. While the nation's attention was fixated on the public debate over $700 billion, the Federal Reserve was executing a series of covert programs that made that sum look insignificant. These operations were cloaked in bureaucratic jargon. Names like the Primary Dealer Credit Facility and the Term Securities Lending Facility, or the Asset-Backed Commercial Paper Money Market Mutual Fund Liquidity Facility. These titles were engineered for obscurity, designed to repel scrutiny, and it was through these mechanisms that the Fed funneled trillions in secret. There was no congressional approval, no public debate, no transparency. There was nothing. The Federal Reserve simply materialized the money and loaned it to the banks. The recipient institutions were not even required to disclose the borrowing. The entire process was hermetically sealed from public knowledge. Congress remained in the dark. Even the participating banks were unaware of who else was receiving funds. It was a system of total secrecy, and it persisted for years. This is the blueprint of how it was executed. Deep within the Federal Reserve's architecture lies a mechanism known as the discount window, an ostensible emergency lending facility. When a bank faces a critical short-term liquidity crisis, it is permitted to borrow directly from the Fed on an overnight basis. The procedure is deceptively simple. Pledge collateral, receive a cash infusion, and repay it the following day, with a nominal interest charge. This is a tool reserved for dire emergencies, and its use is shrouded in secrecy. For if the public knew a bank was resorting to the discount window, a catastrophic run on that bank could be triggered. Consequently, the Fed does not disclose its borrowers. This, we are told, is standard operating procedure. But in the year 2008, the Federal Reserve's actions extended far beyond the conventional use of the discount window. They engineered entirely new, massive lending programs, casting a net that would ensnare the entire financial system. The recipients were not merely commercial banks. The capital flowed to investment banks, hedge funds, foreign banks, and major corporations. Any entity for which Wall Street demanded a lifeline, the Fed provided, all under a strict code of silence. The scale of these loans was almost beyond comprehension. We are not speaking of millions, nor even billions, but hundreds of billions of dollars funneled to single institutions for months at a time. The entire structure was meticulously designed to evade detection. There was no requirement to report these activities to Congress. There was no mandate to disclose them in financial statements. The banks were able to absorb billions in secret funding while presenting a facade of stability to their shareholders, their investors, and the American public. Analytically, it was a flawless operation. Create unlimited money, deliver it to Wall Street, and tell no one. And this silent machine might have run indefinitely, had it not been for a lawsuit. On November 7, 2008, Bloomberg News initiated a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit against the Federal Reserve. They demanded to know which institutions were receiving this bailout money, the exact amounts, and the nature of the collateral being pledged. It was a basic call for transparency. The Fed's response was a stone wall of refusal. They argued the information was confidential, tantamount to trade secrets. Disclosure, they claimed, would inflict irreparable harm on the banks and incite widespread panic. For 2 years, Bloomberg battled them in court. The Federal Reserve lost at every legal turn. In 2010, a federal court mandated the disclosure of the information. The Fed appealed and was defeated again. Finally, in 2011, they were forced to release the data, and the figures it contained were nothing short of staggering. The Federal Reserve had secretly committed $16.1 trillion in total loans to banks and corporations between 2007 and 2010. This was not the $700 billion publicly debated. The peak exposure was $161 trillion. In late 2008, the Fed had an astonishing $777 trillion in outstanding loans simultaneously. Allow me to put that figure into analytical perspective. The entire federal budget for 2008 was $2.9 trillion. The Federal Reserve secretly lent out more than double that amount without a single vote from Congress, without a word to the public. The gross domestic product of the entire United States in 2008 was $14.7 trillion. The Fed secretly loaned more than half of the nation's total economic output to the banks. This was not a bailout. What we are examining is arguably the single largest transfer of wealth in the annals of human history, and the details were concealed from you for 3 years. Now, we must analyze precisely who received this money, because this is where the analysis becomes infuriating. The Federal Reserve released a trove of 21,000 transactions, a data dump spanning thousands of pages, which researchers painstakingly dissected. What they uncovered is chilling. Citigroup received $2.5 trillion, not billion, trillion. Over the full course of the crisis, Citigroup's borrowing from the Federal Reserve totaled $2.5 trillion. Morgan Stanley, $204 trillion. Merrill Lynch, later absorbed by Bank of America, $1.9 trillion. Bank of America itself, $1.3 trillion. Barclays, a British institution, $868 billion. Bear Stearns, $853 billion. Goldman Sachs, $814 billion. The Royal Bank of Scotland, also British, $541 billion. JP Morgan Chase, $391 billion. Deutsche Bank, a German entity, $354 billion. UBS from Switzerland, $287 billion. Credit Suisse, also Swiss, $262 billion. And Lehman Brothers, just before its final collapse, $183 billion. It must be understood that these are cumulative totals. They represent the total sum borrowed across a multitude of transactions. But even with that clarification, the scale remains obscene. Citigroup alone borrowed $2.5 trillion. The entire TARP program, which Congress so publicly debated and authorized, was a mere $700 billion. In secret, Citigroup received 3.5 times that amount. And these figures are not speculation. They originate from the 2011 Government Accountability Office audit. This is not the realm of conspiracy theory. These are irrefutable facts, memorialized in official government documents that the Federal Reserve was compelled to release after its defeat in federal court. When this data finally saw the light of day, the public reaction was one of profound shock. But the timing was tragically late. By 2011, the so-called crisis had passed. The banks were reporting profits again. The executives had received their bonuses. And in the final, bitter accounting, not a single individual faced prosecution. Now we must examine the foreign banks, because this is the element of this saga that should incite genuine outrage. Deutsche Bank, a German institution, received $354 billion in loans from the United States Federal Reserve. UBS, a Swiss bank, $187 billion. Credit Suisse, another Swiss bank, $162 billion. Barclays, a British bank, $868 billion. The Royal Bank of Scotland, a British bank, $541 billion. BNP Paribas, a French bank, $175 billion. Société Générale, also French, $124 billion. Dexia, a Belgian bank, $159 billion. Let me be unequivocally clear. These are foreign institutions, not American ones. Foreign. And yet, the United States Federal Reserve funneled hundreds of billions of American dollars to them. The critical question remains, why? The reason was their operational footprint within the U.S. They maintained American subsidiaries inextricably woven into the global financial architecture. And when the cataclysm struck, their singular, desperate need was for dollars, a veritable ocean of them. Their own central banks were powerless to intervene, as the toxic assets were denominated in dollars. Consequently, the Federal Reserve extended the funds backed by U.S. taxpayers without seeking any permission, and without informing a single soul. Consider Deutsche Bank, the very institution fined billions for the manipulation of LIBOR, for facilitating financial crimes, for systemic fraud. This same entity received $354 billion in clandestine loans from the United States Federal Reserve, and you were never informed. Congress was kept in the dark. The American taxpayer was made the unwitting guarantor for German banks, Swiss banks, British banks, and French banks. And the full scope of this remained a secret until 2011, a full 3 years later, now. Let us analyze the terms of these loans, because it is here that the architecture of the corruption becomes starkly evident. The Federal Reserve did not merely lend money at prevailing market rates. They dispersed it at an interest rate approaching zero. The discount rate in late 2008 was a mere 0.5%, half of 1%. This allowed banks to borrow billions at a negligible cost. The critical question is, what could they do with such capital? They were presented with an almost unbelievable opportunity. Purchase treasury bonds yielding a guaranteed 3 to 4%. It was a mechanism for instant, risk-free profit. This is the anatomy of the carry trade, and through it, the banks siphoned billions using the capital the Fed provided. This occurred while homeowners were facing foreclosure at mortgage rates between 6 and 7%. The banks were borrowing at 0.5%. The very institutions that triggered the crisis through their predatory mortgage practices were now being rewarded with a virtually limitless supply of free money. And the profits? They were retained, funneled into executive bonuses, paid out as shareholder dividends, and used for stock buybacks. None of this capital was directed to assist struggling homeowners, and none of it was used for lending to small businesses. It was a direct injection into the pockets of Wall Street. The Federal Reserve had engineered a covert, massive wealth transfer from the public to the financial sector, and they concealed it. We must now dissect the collateral, because the Fed's official narrative insists these were not gifts, but loans secured by assets. The premise was that if the banks defaulted, the Fed would seize the collateral, thereby eliminating any risk to the taxpayer. Is that correct? It is fundamentally wrong. The collateral was toxic waste, mortgage-backed securities. The very instruments of financial poison that caused the crisis, assets with a real market value of maybe 30 to 40 cents on the dollar, were accepted by the Fed at their full face value. Consider a mortgage-backed security worth $30 million in the open market. The Federal Reserve would issue a loan of $100 million against it. This was a system of massive over-collateralization engineered entirely for the bank's benefit. The Fed did not mark the assets to market. They simply accepted whatever fictitious value the bank claimed. This allowed banks to purge their worst assets onto the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. In return, they received cash at 100% value. If the asset collapsed to zero, the Federal Reserve, meaning you, the taxpayer, absorbed the entire loss. This was not lending. This was a sophisticated laundering operation. The Fed took worthless assets off bank ledgers, replaced them with cash, and disguised the transaction as a loan. When Bloomberg and the Government Accountability Office demanded an accounting of this collateral, the Fed refused to disclose details, citing confidentiality. To this day, we do not know the full extent of taxpayer losses on those toxic assets. The Federal Reserve refuses to say. Now, let us examine what you received. While Wall Street was being secretly infused with trillions at 0.5% interest, what was the government's response for ordinary citizens? Foreclosures. 3.8 million foreclosures in 2010 alone. Families saw their homes seized. Life savings were obliterated. Individuals who were lured into homes with predatory loans and fraudulent appraisals, loans they were assured were manageable, were suddenly thrown onto the street. And what support did they receive? The Home Affordable Modification Program, a system supposedly designed to help homeowners alter their mortgages and prevent foreclosure. The program was a catastrophic failure. Homeowners were forced to apply, submit endless documentation, and then wait for months. The majority were ultimately denied. Out of the $75 billion allocated for HAMP, only $25 billion was ever spent. And of the 4 million homeowners the program was projected to assist, a mere 1.3 million received a permanent modification. Meanwhile, the banks received trillions, in secret, at near zero rates, against worthless collateral. And the homeowners received nothing. You lose your job in the recession that Wall Street manufactured. You can no longer pay your mortgage. The bank forecloses. It takes your house and sells it for a fraction of its worth. But this is of no consequence to the bank, which has already been rescued in secret by the Fed with your tax dollars, leaving you homeless. That is a stark reality of the 2008 bailout. That is the forensic analysis of what truly transpired. Now we must address the issue of prosecutions. Because surely, if banks engaged in systemic fraud, if they lied about the fundamental quality of their mortgages, if they sold toxic securities to investors while secretly betting against those same assets, if they manipulated global interest rates, if they laundered money, so surely there were consequences, arrests, prison sentences. The answer is a chilling 0. Not a single major Wall Street executive faced prosecution for orchestrating the financial collapse. Not one. The FBI had 10,000 agents assigned to investigate mortgage fraud back in 2007. Yet, by 2008, the vast majority were abruptly reassigned to counterterrorism. Then came the final nail in the coffin. The Department of Justice, under the Obama administration, made the conscious decision not to pursue prosecution. The rationale? A doctrine that had already poisoned the system. Too big to fail had mutated into too big to jail. Eric Holder, the Attorney General himself, stated on the record that prosecuting these colossal banks could trigger a catastrophic destabilization of the entire financial system. And so they walked away. In place of prosecution, they were given fines. Billions of dollars in penalties. That sounds like justice, doesn't it? It was a facade. The fines were a calculated, meaningless gesture. Consider Goldman Sachs. They paid a settlement of $5 billion for fraud. A staggering sum to the average person, but for Goldman, which generated $100 billion in revenue that year, it was nothing. The fine amounted to a mere 5% of their revenue, a trivial cost of doing business. And here is the most perverse part of the equation. Who truly paid these fines? The shareholders, not the executives who orchestrated the deception. Those executives, they were rewarded with bonuses. Take Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan, who collected $20 million in 2008, the very year the crisis detonated. Or Lloyd Blankfein, CEO of Goldman Sachs, who secured $54 million in 2007. And Brian Moynihan, the CEO of Bank of America, who took home $8 million in 2010. While the public's wealth evaporated, theirs multiplied, and not a single one of them ever saw the inside of a courtroom. But we must examine the bonuses, because this is the detail that exposes the entire affair as a deliberate scam. The year is 2008. the absolute apex of the financial crisis. Banks are imploding, they are receiving massive bailouts, and they are secretly borrowing trillions from the Federal Reserve. So what did they do with this lifeline? They paid themselves bonuses. Wall Street dispersed $18.4 billion in bonuses in 2008. That's billion with a B. This was happening during the most severe financial crisis since the Great Depression. The very same institutions that were secretly drawing down hundreds of billions of dollars from the Fed were simultaneously awarding their employees billions in bonus compensation. Let's look at the specifics. Morgan Stanley borrowed $107 billion from the Fed in a single month, October of 2008. In that very same quarter, they paid out $6.4 billion in compensation. Goldman Sachs drew $69 billion from the Fed in October 2008. That same year, they paid $10.9 billion in compensation, which included $4.8 billion in pure bonuses. Then there was Citigroup, which borrowed a staggering $2.5 trillion in total, and yet still managed to pay out $5.3 billion in bonuses in 2008. They were taking public funds and directly transferring it into their own pockets. And the mechanism they used to conceal this is even more alarming. You must first understand that the Federal Reserve is not a government entity. It is a quasi-private institution, technically owned by its member banks and merely overseen by a board appointed by the president. Critically, it operates with almost total independence. The Fed requires no approval from Congress for its lending operations. Under its emergency powers, it can conjure money from thin air and lend it out. This authority stems from Section 133 of the Federal Reserve Act, which permits lending to any entity under unusual and exigent circumstances. The crucial question, of course, is who gets to define what is unusual and exigent? The Federal Reserve itself. So in 2008, the Fed declared its own emergency, initiated the lending of trillions, and told no one. Legally, they were under no obligation to do so. Access to their discount window is, by design, confidential. The new emergency lending facilities they engineered were shrouded in the same secrecy. This meant the banks were not required to disclose these massive loans on their financial statement. Consequently, the investors had no idea. The shareholders were kept in the dark. The public was oblivious. Even Congress was unaware. It was, analytically, the perfect crime. Generate currency, channel it to the banks, and maintain absolute secrecy. And the scheme would have remained buried forever, if not for a lawsuit from Bloomberg. The Federal Reserve fought that lawsuit tooth and nail for 2 years. Their argument was that disclosure would inflict competitive harm on the banks. They claimed it would incite public panic. They insisted it was protected as confidential supervisory information. The courts rejected these arguments, affirming the public's fundamental right to know. But by the time this information was finally forced into the light in 2011, it was far too late. The crisis had passed. The money was already in the bank's possession. The bonuses had been paid out, and the event went largely unnoticed by a distracted public. Now, we must analyze the motive, because this was never about saving the economy. This was about preserving Wall Street. The major financial institutions had made a series of catastrophic wagers on instruments like mortgage-backed securities and collateralized debt obligations, and credit default swaps. They were leveraged at ratios of 30 to 1, even 40 to 1, meaning for every single dollar of their own capital, they had borrowed 30 or 40 more. When the housing market inevitably buckled, the entire edifice came crashing down. The banks were functionally insolvent. Their assets were valued at less than their liabilities. In a functioning system, they should have failed. They should have been forced into bankruptcy, their shareholders completely wiped out. Their executives should have been fired. That is the principle of capitalism. But Wall Street had a contingency. For decades, they had been systematically embedding their own people within the government. Consider Hank Paulson, Treasury Secretary in 2008, who was the former CEO of Goldman Sachs. His successor, Tim Geithner, was the former president of the New York Fed, with deep ties to Wall Street. And Ben Bernanke, the Fed chairman, their fundamental belief was in aggressive central bank intervention. These were not impartial regulators, They were operatives from the heart of Wall Street. And when the moment of reckoning arrived, they shielded their own not with the $700 billion public spectacle that invited debate and scrutiny, but with a shadow operation of secret loans, trillions in clandestine funding that would remain unknown until the point of no return. And the strategy was brutally effective. By 2011, when the data was finally unsealed, the banks were reporting massive profits again. Market values were soaring. Executives had become fantastically wealthy, and the public was sold a simple narrative. The bailouts worked. The system was saved. But this is a fundamental lie. The system wasn't saved. It was propped up. There is a critical difference. Here is the analysis they actively suppress. The very institutions deemed too big to fail in 2008 are now colossally larger. In 2008, the top 5 banks commanded 40% of all U.S. banking assets. Today, their control has expanded to 47%. They are bigger, their power more consolidated, their too big to fail status more dangerously entrenched than ever. JP Morgan Chase alone sits on $3.2 trillion in assets. Bank of America holds $2.5 trillion, Wells Fargo $1.9 trillion, Citigroup $1.8 trillion, Goldman Sachs $1.5 trillion. These are the exact same entities that imploded in 2008, now magnified in size because the bailout didn't dismantle them. It made the behemoths grew larger, ensuring that the next crisis, whenever it arrives, will necessitate an exponentially larger rescue. The logic is inescapable. The institutions are bigger, the leverage is higher, and the systemic risk is now catastrophic. And they operate with the full knowledge that they will be rescued again, because the precedent is set. This is the definition of moral hazard. When you insulate any entity from the consequences of its disastrous decisions, you guarantee that its future decisions will be even more reckless. That is exactly what transpired. Wall Street learned a vital lesson, that no matter how reckless, no matter how fraudulent, no matter how catastrophic their bets became, the government would intervene to save them. A system designed to socialize all losses and privatize all gains. Heads, they win. Tails, you lose. And here is the most alarming part of the equation. Next time, they may not even need the Federal Reserve for their rescue. Because in 2010, the Dodd-Frank Act was passed. Financial reform supposedly engineered to prevent another meltdown. But buried deep within its legislative code was a new mechanism: bail-ins. In the next crisis, instead of taxpayers bailing out the banks, depositors will be forced to bail them in, using your deposits. If a bank is on the verge of collapse, they now have the legal authority to convert your cash deposits into equity, bank stock, utterly worthless stock in a failing institution. This is not a theory. Cyprus executed this in 2013. Deposits over 100,000 euros were seized and forcibly converted into shares of failed banks. Depositors lost 47.5% of their money, legally, overnight. The Dodd-Frank Act authorizes the very same procedure in the United States. It is cloaked in the bureaucratic term resolution authority. The FDIC is empowered to take control of a failing bank and restructure it. And the primary method for that restructuring is to bail in the depositors. Your savings are converted into bank shares. The bank is recapitalized on paper, and you lose your money. Legally. They will not call it a seizure. They will call it a bail-in. But it is functionally identical. They will appropriate your money to save the bank, just as they appropriated your tax dollars in 2008. Only this time, the withdrawal will be made directly from your account. So what is the inescapable conclusion from this data? The 2008 bailout was a calculated deception. You were told the cost was $700 billion. The audited real number was $16 trillion. You were told it was to save the economy. It was to save Wall Street. You were told taxpayers would be repaid. The banks received the funds at near zero interest rates and leveraged them into billions in profits. You were told it was a temporary intervention. The banks are now larger than ever before. You were told there would be accountability. There were zero prosecutions of high-level executives. You were told it would not happen again. It will. And the next time, the blueprint involves your deposits. The Federal Reserve, the Treasury, Congress, Wall Street, every single one of them lied. For 3 years, they actively concealed $16 trillion in secret loans. They used your money to bail out foreign banks. They permitted executives to pay themselves billions in bonuses, and they constructed a legal fortress to ensure no one went to prison. This was the greatest financial transfer of wealth in human history. And they got away with it. Because by the time the public learned the truth, it was a historical footnote. The money was gone, the banks were secure, and they were already wargaming the next crisis, preparing to run the same play again. If this analysis has opened your eyes to the reality of 2008, subscribe. Because when the next crisis makes landfall, when the talk of bailouts begins anew, you will need to know the truth. Not the $700 billion lie they will broadcast on television, but the trillions in secret programs they have already codified in the fine print. They did it before, they are prepared to do it again.